You mentioned that sort of in the background you had in Mexico these corporations that wreaked havoc on their economy, used up the people, and in many cases have left. Thinking of our own country and the rise of unchecked corporate power and the constant decline of labor, how do you see that translating to our future?
Well, I mean, basically what they did to Youngstown in Ohio, they're doing to Juarez. If I was running a corporation, my mandate would be to make money or I'd lose my job. We have created a system where the boundaries on corporations is they can move anywhere they want and not pay any of the damage they leave behind. So I think the ball's in our court. We don't get anywhere by claiming these entities, the banks, the corporations, are run by evil people. The problem is they're run by people just like the people in this room. So we have to create rules if we want a different kind of behavior. So I don't see things getting better. I mean, the point of a corporation is to produce things as cheaply as possible. I'm afraid I don't agree with Ron Paul and other libertarians that they'll take care of the environment, et cetera, et cetera. It's just nonsense. Look at the goddamn planet. You know what happens if there's no regulations. Look at this basin. When I was a kid, I used to come out here in the 60s, you know, and roll joints and jump in the ocean and stuff, and you couldn't see the mountains, you know, because of pollution requirements, and now you can see the mountains, you know. So anyway, we have to decide what kind of world we want. If you want a deregulated world, fine, you know. You're going to get more of the same. Does that answer?
It does. Do you think there was a time in America when workers organized and seemed to present a check to corporate power, and that time?
When I was a kid, people used to buy clothes and they'd look and see if it had a union label. I originally started out in a blue-collar neighborhood in Chicago. And, you know, unions were like gods because the people in the unions had worked for, you know, they'd been like maquiladora workers, and then suddenly the union came, and by God, they had money. You got to realize that this is all a race. There is no labor history in this country. I doubt if there's a labor historian on this campus. There's no labor reporters anymore. Everybody works, but nobody covers it. Did you ever ask yourself about that? You know, Jimmy Hoffa, who finally went to prison, took over the Teamsters about 1955, and by 1960 he tripled the wages for truckers. Suddenly guys with no necks, you know, drank beer, were buying houses and their kids could go to college. Well, that's a hell of an achievement. You know. Now what's happened here, nobody wants to talk about, is the greatest anti-poverty program in the history of Mexico and in the history of the United States is illegal immigration. I can take a guy down there that's making $5 a day, can't even feed himself, from Oaxaca. I can transport him to Chicago, throw him in a back room making dishes, and he starts sending $100 a week home. Now you tell me any other program in the history of the world that's raised living standards as fast as that. You don't tell me this damn wall matters. It doesn't. And we got at least 10 million people here illegally from Mexico, and I know why. They want to survive. The only thing that slowed down the migration is something our government doesn't want to talk about. They found a way to keep Mexicans from coming here. They killed the American economy. But when it revives, they'll come. And they'll come because there's nothing there for them anymore. Well, like in Mexico, essentially unions or company unions are controlled by the state. And to really organize labor means you get killed. What happened in the United States, and I saw it in my lifetime, is the success of the union movement sent their children to colleges. The children became basically white collar and thought they didn't need a union. And that's a myth. No one will ever get a decent wage at the Walmarts of the world without a union. No corporation is ever going to raise wages on its own unless it's forced to. Most people are not geniuses, not highly skilled. They never will be. We're going to have all kinds of people in this country. And without unions, without mutual aid organizations, which a union is, they will be treated like garbage and crushed. And that's what we're seeing today. We're seeing increasingly wages collapse for most Americans as they go into what's cheerfully called the service industry, which means low wages and no rights. You're just disposable goods. Until we change that, we're going to have a deteriorating country. You can't have social peace unless you share social wealth.
You spoke about the immigration as an anti-poverty program that's been very successful. And we have, at last count, at least 12 million undocumented immigrants here in this country. Do you think that there is an effect also? It lifts them out of poverty, but does it also depress wages for the citizens and native-born?
There is no question, zero question, that immigration, illegals especially, depresses wages for American workers. This has been true for 150 years. During the Homestead strike of the Carnegie Steel Works, what Carnegie and his partner did, Frick, was bring in European immigrants to break American labor. That's the pattern. What I think is that the people, no one is coming north from Mexico to lower American wages. No one is coming north to break unions. The only solution to this, since you can't wall off the world, and since Mexico and a lot of these countries are collapsing for various reasons, is you have to have a union movement here. You have to have a world where new labor can't lower wages. It has to be paid decent wages. Now, I'm old enough, when I was a kid in the 50s and 60s, my people in the Midwest worked in slaughterhouses. It was a rough, dangerous job, but it paid okay. The wages now in a slaughterhouse are half in real dollars what they were in 1965. And the reason is, if you go into a slaughterhouse, everybody in them's illegal with phony papers. The packing industry has used illegal labor to crush wages. So what has to happen, I actually once told this to James Hoffa Jr., with the truckers, is the only thing you can do, what you have to do, is make Mexican truckers legal here, and they have to be paid the same as American truckers. And they can run on our roads. Otherwise, they're going to destroy wages here. Not because they want to. I've interviewed dozens of them. They work like dogs. You know, they make $12,000 a year. They have 80-hour weeks. They're all on amphetamines. Their tires explode, and they're barely surviving. So if they're going to come here, and they're under treaty, they're going to have to. They're going to run a load from Juarez to New York. You want them in your union.
And what did Hoffa say when you suggested that?
Well, he's not against that, you know. He wants to protect his members. The problem with the American labor movement is simple. It got fat and happy. You've seen it in the auto industry. It's protecting itself, the benefits for workers, but not new workers. There's a two-tier wage system. Well, this is like reinstituting slavery. A job's a job. A living wage is not hard to compute. It's what a person can live on. The guys that are 20 can't live on less than the guys who are 50. They got in under the old contract. You have to pay more. Your standard of living is not going to be lowered if you pay more for goods. Your standard of living is going to be lowered if your neighbor's unemployed, if your streets aren't kept up, if there's high crime, if your schools are falling apart. Then your standard of living declines. It's immaterial how many objects you can buy after a point. What you have to do is create a population that thinks they can't be happy unless the people that make the object live a decent life. Now, I don't think that's that hard. You know.
What do you see catalyzing that? Do you think it's the Occupy Wall Street movement? What do you think could be the
No,
force?
I think Occupy Wall Street isn't going to accomplish much except it's a wake-up call. A bunch of people, to their credit, said this thing isn't working. But something has to be done. They're the start. They're the kids sitting down in 1957 or 8 at the lunch counter in the South and demanding to be served. They did that, and 8 years later, the walls came tumbling down. The 64-65 Civil Rights Act that essentially outlawed discrimination on the basis of sex and race forever in our country. So Occupy Wall Street's a start. You know, it's not a policy, it's a response. You know, it's a cry of anger and pain.
And you think it's possible for workers to rise up and for people to band together and push back against
I'll
this
tell you
tide?
the first thing that has to be done for workers to rise up, people have to realize they are workers. They're not professionals. They're not this. They're not that. They are workers. Somebody owns them. And unless they band together, the people that own them are going to treat them like dirt, as they are now. They're going to work them to death, and then when they get near retirement, they're going to throw them away. Suddenly say, you know, you don't work here anymore. That's the policy now. Until people admit that, until they stop looking down on working people, saying, well, I'm not like them, they're going to get screwed and deserve to be.
Do you think there's space in mainstream corporate press for more labor stories? Do you think that it will accommodate that?
No. No, people have to demand it. There is no labor reporting in this country. None. You know.
What happened to it?
It went away with the union movement. You know, when I was a kid, every major newspaper had a labor reporter covering labor. Now everybody in this country works more than when I was a kid. When I was a kid, a lot of women didn't work. They raised children, for example. Now everybody works, but nobody thinks they actually labor. There's no labor reporting. Nobody reports what they do and how they're treated. I'll give you an example. It's hard to get real reports on wages. For years, the New York Times would report the maquila industry and give a wage, which was all the benefits added. And nobody writing those stories thought that was their wage. They thought their wage was what they took home. But suddenly they had this magical number. They did the same thing in the auto industry. For years, they would claim these guys were overpaid, and look, with the benefits, they're making $60 an hour. Well, all that was bullshit. They didn't pay any bills. That's not what these men and women were living on. Well, there's a disconnect. I learned that when I covered a copper strike in the 80s. But the people I worked with in media were extremely hostile to the miners, because you could graduate from high school, go into the pits in Arizona, and this was 30 years ago, and make $25,000 a year. They were making more than the reporters. The reporters resented it. Well, I didn't. I wasn't going into a hole in the ground making big rocks into little rocks. I'd want more than 25, but I didn't begrudge them getting a decent wage. The unions are, except in some residual industries, they're finished. And I'll tell you why. The factories left. I was with Charlie Kernigan traveling in Ohio, and we were in a little town, and Huffy Bicycle had moved to China. It's a little Ohio town, the factory's empty. Generations have worked in the same shop, father to son, now nothing. Like I was telling you about Tim McVeigh. There's nothing. I mean, obviously what Tim McVeigh did was wrong, but it wasn't from Mars that he got this demon idea that was happening in the world. It's because the world his father had, he couldn't have. This world where, you know, you could sort of be a blue-collar guy, make a living, etc.
So when people don't have access to the American dream, they go to extremes.
They can.
They can.
Hopefully they will. You know, the real problem is when they just go into depression and don't do anything. That's why, look, I have my qualms about Occupy Wall Street. That's a hell of a lot better than being a couch potato and saying it's hopeless. They're making people think about things. That's their purpose. They're making us, you know, just saying the 99%. That's a revelation to most people. One of the things you'll find is almost any American, no matter what his income, will say he's middle class. I mean, you know, there is no upper or lower. Apparently, we're all middle. I mean, you know, this is nonsense. You know, class is a forbidden word in our society. You know, just like poverty is. Climate's the final card. And the reason it's the final card is there's no way to wall it out. We have to do this mutually or we can't do anything. Garrett Hardin, a brilliant sort of Catholic philosopher, wrote an essay in the 70s called Lifeboat Ethics, saying if you project the population against the resources, you're going to get a society where people are in a lifeboat, people are swimming toward them, and they have to let them drown, because otherwise the lifeboat sinks. That, you know, in other words, there will be the haves and the have-nots. That you would create this fortress culture. Well, that's impossible with climate. If China keeps putting that much carbon in the air, you can't wall it out. If the climate shifts, there's no way to protect yourself. You cannot build a fortress.
How do you get the return of manufacturing then without rising climate disaster?
What you do is you get the return of work. I mean, manufacturing can proceed without the same emissions. You know, what if manufacturing is based on solar or electrical input? I mean, what if you can't make as many objects? You can still have work. Yeah, that's what people need, is work.
We live in a culture where identity is based on work. If you want misbehavior, it gets people unemployed permanently. That's the problem. That's a problem since the Second War of our cities. We have redundant poor whites and redundant poor blacks that were essentially exiled from the countryside to the city where there's no work for them. And then we wonder why they get violent.